Disc jockey John Said made a brief appearance on Radio London during September. Real name John Cross, he had been employed by the station as a salesman in December 1964 and returned to Curzon Street after just a fortnight aboard ship. Apart from the day-to-day broadcast operations which kept the DJs busy, there was much activity among the Galaxy's crew during the summer of 1965. Dennis Maitland was responsible for shipping out timber to improve the living conditions for DJs and crew alike. This was followed by a complete external repaint which saw the distinctive black and red RL logo painted on the funnel and Radio London 266 emblazoned along each side of the hull.
Right up until 2 tomorrow morning, the sound of music.
Every evening, give him 6 to 9. Always talking funny, sometimes out of line.
Yes, Kenny Everett, the people's choice, but have the people ever really been asked?
Apart from John Said's short stay on the Galaxy, it was not until October 1965 that Radio London lost its first DJ to a shore-based career. Pete Brady left to freelance with Radio Luxembourg and the BBC, although he would later reappear on Big L, presenting the pre-recorded Rivale Sound-Off show. Brady's replacement on The Breakfast Show was Dave Cash, the regular breakfast relief since joining the station in December 1964. But his permanent arrival sounded the death knell of Kenny and Cash.
What's the hottest news story this century? Secret Service have been trying to grab the secret of it for years. The CIA has been on its trail for months.
Well, British intelligence has been fighting for the key to the mystery for ever since I can remember.
What are they on about?
Why? Where?
Who? They're talking about the Rabbit Patch, the secret to happy breakfasting in Britain.
I don't know.
That's the secret.
With Pete Brady gone, Ben Toney was anxious to make up the DJ numbers as soon as possible, and Tony Windsor recommended a certain 22-year-old from Radio Caroline, one Anthony Kenneth Blackburn.
I was on Radio Caroline. I really did want to join Radio London because it was, I thought, the better station, and it was beautifully run on commercial terms. And I came over, and I remember coming up towards Radio London once on the little tender boat was there.
That's right. That was when I first put the idea to you. I used to look at you through binoculars and think, yes, he's a likely lad, I think. Well, I'll ask him.
You wanted me to change my name to Mark Roman.
Yes.
You said if you give a phone call back in London, there might be a job here or something.
Yes.
To my horror, I was expected to call myself Mark Roman and be in charge of the Roman Empire. And I said no.
To see my agent, you said to me.
I said, no way,
So
Tony.
who is this rooster?
This was the perfect opportunity for a Wimbledon Pally DJ called Graham Wallace to further his career. He had spent a week on Radio City, but Radio London was his favourite station, and friends encouraged him to apply for a job. He didn't have to.
I got a call, so I went up and saw Ben Toney, and he said, there's a position open, we know you. The guys have said they would like to work with you because they already know you. So I joined them and did a voice test, and Ben Toney said, yeah, you got the job. You know, it's just a formality, fine. I think that was on a Thursday or something. What name do you want to choose? And I think I used something like Pete Jordan. And I think that was the name that sort of came to me. I thought, it's not quite DJ, but PJ the DJ, or something trite. I met Philip Birch, and he said, it's not bad. He said, but how about Mark Roman, and we can call the programme the Roman Empire? And I said, great, give me the job. You want to call me Cilla Black, I'll do the damn thing. And so that's how it came about. And it was simply that they wanted to do a programme called The Roman Empire. They'd offered the opportunity to Tony Blackman, who didn't want to change his name, and he turned it down.
Who was Mark Roman? Well, the critics say he was some kind of DJ.
Why was he hanging around the Stones tour then?
Yes, Mark Roman. Yeah, I know. I guess you'd say it was a social problem. I guess I love him.
Yes, all right, Terry, I'll buy that one. Mark Roman, His Empire and Appetite. It's a good title, then. Run it, will you? Mark Roman on Radio London from 9 to 12 at night.
Mark Roman was to get another lucky break within weeks of joining Radio London when, in November 1965, he took over the Kenny Everett Show, and the Roman Empire became a regular fixture. Everett had received several reprimands from Radio London's management for his on-air put-down of the World Tomorrow religious programme. Unfortunately for Kenny, the programme featured in the middle of his show, and he could not resist poking fun at the host, Garner Ted Armstrong. Things came to a head when Armstrong himself lodged a complaint and threatened to withdraw the programme. Curzon Street decided enough was enough. Philip Birch.
Kenny was easily our most creative presenter, disc jockey, what have you. And of course, creativity is very hard to control. In fact, it cannot be controlled. And so Kenny would upset advertisers from time to time, and I had to remind him that, fun as that it was, Radio London was a business, and it was a business to make money, and you didn't kick your clients in the teeth.
Ben Toney remembers visiting the Galaxy to give Everett his final warning.
And I warned him twice. I told him, I said, look, I'm not going to put up with this. And I think at that point, Kenny was ready to get off the ship anyway. I think that was his main problem. He just wanted off the ship, and he didn't really want to come to me and say, I quit. So he just did something to make me fire him, sack him. And I did.
Ed Stewart recalls a previous occasion that almost cost Kenny Everett his job.
Kenny was very naive. He was only a young lad, Maurice Cole, when he came on board the ship. And I was still on holiday relief. I was only just joined the ship, but the Beatles Yesterday had come out, and everybody thought, oh, beautiful record, beautiful song this is. And we were sitting out, and about 10 o'clock at night, and it was the middle of the summer, so there was still a bit of light around, and we'd twiddling the knob on the receiver to see which station to pick up. And we picked up some other station, and Yesterday was playing. And I said to Kenny, oh, it's a great piece of music. Oh, it's great, beautiful, isn't it? I said, you know, Kenny, it's like a musical orgasm. He said, what's that? I said, well, it's like every time I hear this record, I have an orgasm. Oh. The next day on his show, he goes on the air and he plays Yesterday by the Beatles. He said, you know, listeners, every time Ed Stewart hears this, he has an orgasm. Now, in those days, to use words like orgasm was unheard of. And he was actually divested of his job, but reinstated 24 hours later. Because, you know, it was just a mistake. He just did not know what an orgasm was. Well, he obviously never experienced one, and didn't even know what the word meant.
Once again, Ben Toney found himself sifting through audition tapes and holding interviews with potential Radio London disc jockeys. Among the candidates was Johnny Flux from Radio City. Also recruited was Canadian Michael Graham, whose broadcasting experience included a spell in Bermuda working with Duncan Johnson before coming to England to work as an actor and model in television and cinema commercials. Once aboard the Galaxy, Johnny Flux and Michael Graham became John Edward and Mike Lennox, respectively.
Dave D, Dozy, Beaky, Mick, and Titch. You make it move. Don't know where it is in the chart. Yes, I do. It's number 9. Had a quick glance over my shoulder.
You're listening to the spot that just swings. We're sitting back here enjoying ourselves immensely.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and howdy, friends and neighbors.
Dave Cash was on board the Galaxy at Christmas 1965 to help celebrate Radio London's first birthday. 24-hour broadcasting was introduced for 3 days, but on Christmas Eve, echoing the events of the previous Christmas, an intoxicated Dutch crew member drew a knife on a fellow seaman following a row. Ed Stewart.
This guy suddenly, in the middle of our Christmas dinner, got out a knife and started threatening everybody and saying how much he hated the British and what were we doing in a Dutch ship. We didn't like having him on board much because he was always drinking and he was always a bit of a thug. And this one Christmas, he has obviously had much too much.
Relief Captain de Braa and the Galaxy's mate managed to lock the Dutchman in the engine room before the tender was called to transport him to Harwich, where HM Immigration subsequently deported him to Holland.
The police actually came out from Harwich to try and help us. And these were two coppers with the helmets. And he was then carted off. They brought him back again in chains, and he was taken back to Holland because he was under Dutch law.
Next time you're in the shops. Yes, Tom Thumb Cigars. This Christmas, give him the mild, satisfying cigar of cigarette size. Tom Thumb, 10 for 5 shillings. Tom Thumb, the Christmas gift for men.
Very good advice there. Hey, you know what? 29 last week, number 30 this week. Who knows where it'll be next week? I don't know. That's this afternoon, in fact. Roger Moore.
Ashore, Radio London held a special first birthday party for advertisers. A total of 250 products and services had been advertised on the station since its launch at Christmas 1964, and many more were now being lined up for 1966. Meanwhile, Postmaster General Anthony Wedgwood Benn continued to threaten legislation that would, among other things, prevent British companies from advertising their wares on the offshore stations. The government had little regard for the advertising floodgates that had opened and for the offshore radio audience, which had now grown to around 20 million people. Half that number were estimated to be listening to Radio London. Eddie Blackwell.
We did a lot of research. We did it with NOP. There was a link there. We knew them quite well, and Philip had worked with them, I think, in his other jobs. So it was very authentic research. We had a massive audience. We had a lot of coverage in the north, because obviously the signal would travel by sea along the coast. We had a bit of a bleak spot in the Midlands. We weren't quite so well in the Midlands, but we were getting a huge audience.
Philip Birch remained optimistic that the Labour government would bow to pressure and introduce local land-based commercial radio run along similar lines to the established systems of North America, Canada and Australia, and he was determined that Radio London would be part of the setup.
Esta es la estación número 1 en London, England. Es mi favorita. Wonderful Radio London. Olé!
Wonderful Radio London, where your hearing swings. The music sings on wonderful Radio London. Big L.
The new year of 1966 saw appalling weather conditions in the North Sea, and in the early hours of the 12th of January during a Force 9 gale, the Galaxy lost her sea anchors and drifted inside territorial waters.
The bow was literally heaving. And a wave would hit it and it would just lift up and bang and then crash down again. And then because the waves were so high, there was this enormous amount of slack. The waves were probably around about 15, 20 feet high. So you can imagine this giant chain suddenly going very, very taut and then slackening down. And then this massive 1,000 tons of shit being pushed up by the ocean and cracking onto this. And eventually it went bang and it broke.
We were going toward a sandbank on our starboard side, and if we had hit it with a 150-foot mast, we just keeled right over. So I woke up all the boys, and there's absolutely no panic at all. And Ed Stewart, who was the heaviest sleeper of all, just went, "Oh, is that all?" and wanted to go back to bed, but we couldn't be in bed, you know.
I seem to remember getting woken up and everybody going to the mess deck and being told by the captain what was happening, that we were drifting, and because the steering mechanism was faulty There was no way he could steer us, so we were at the mercy of the tides and the winds.
And now we're adrift in some fairly heavy seas. The captain decided that, okay, we'll steer the boat. So members of the crew went down and reconnected the chains to the tiller, which passed either side of the studio. So they had been disconnected because previously, as the rudder moved, then these chains were clanking backwards and forwards in where the studio was. Made a lot of noise, so they were disconnected. They were reconnected. Captain goes up to the bridge. Good. Let us have some power. Fine. Turn the wheel. Snap. Nothing. So now we can't steer ourselves. So the captain said, fine, we'll steer on the engines. But we had 2 engine rooms. There weren't 2 engines in one room. There were 1 engine in one room and 1 engine in another room. And we only needed 1 engineer on board. So we could either run 1 engine and then he'd run across and go another one. So all he simply did was he had 1 engineer in 1 engine room, and he would say, right, full ahead, stop, full astern, or whatever instructions. And he would simply wait to see which way the wind and the tide was blowing Galaxy. And if it was pointing towards the shore, he'd go hard astern. And if it was pointing in other directions, he'd say full ahead, or whatever. And this is how he steered it. And come dawn the following morning, we were sitting off a sandbank, which was not unusual because we were surrounded by sandbanks. The weather had calmed, and we were in a very... I mean, I think after a couple of hours of this, oh, sorry, we'll go back to bed. Captain Bunniger knows what he's doing, so let him get on with it.
He was a great character, a smashing guy. But he hated the Germans.
Out of the corner of my eye, I could see a ship coming. I remember saying my prayers. And it was a big ship to pull us back. And a voice rang out in a deep, guttural German accent. Can I help you? And Captain Bunniger said, piss off. And I think that frightened me more, than drifting. And finally, the lifeguard came, and we were safe. And I went down into the captain's cabin, have a drink. And he looked at me, he said, you think I'm a funny man, don't you? And I said, well, I think you're a nice man, but I thought you were very funny up there at one stage. And he then told me the story of what the Germans had done to his wife and his children in Holland when he was away at sea, in the most moving way. And I could see why he did it.
And we thought, oh, this is terrific. And Ocean Cock turned up, and that was it. And then we were towed back into position. Things were sorted out, and we went back on air.
Yes, midday we went back on air and told them that everything was all right now. We'd been towed back, and we were allowed to broadcast again, because once we were back inside British waters, we weren't allowed to broadcast. We had to wait to get towed back, you see.
Despite the unpredictable nature of the weather occasionally playing havoc with Radio London's transmissions and the ever-present threat of government legislation to close down the station, the advertising was still pouring in. One long-term advertiser was Colgate-Palmolive. They had signed to the station in May 1965, sponsoring a request show airing on Sunday mornings at 11 o'clock.
Now for the songs you've been waiting to hear, the pop songs, the top songs, so lend us your ear. The songs you've requested are ready to go on the Colgate-Palmolive's great radio show. It's the Colgate-Palmolive Requester!
A sponsor was found for Tony Windsor's popular weekday coffee break spot, also at 11 o'clock, starting in February.
Well, we were advertising a certain brand of coffee, the name of which always confused me, saying I have a funny walk, because it was called Camp Coffee. And I remember Philip Birch sending me a memo and saying, we have a new sponsor for your coffee break, which by this time had become very popular. And he said, I think it's right up your street. Cam Coffee. That was one of his very few jokes. And the boys, of course, were hilarious about it because, we had, as you do, when you live with 26 guys, many, many jokes. And this was too much. And so I thought when I did my first broadcast, well, I'm not going to say Cam Coffee. I'm going to have to say Cam Coffee. You see, I'm going to have to throw it at them. And of course I did that all the time. After working from 9 till 11, I really look forward to my break, and I look forward to the pleasure of your company too, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, at this time each day, Monday to Friday, and particularly to camp. And I know millions out there of you are joining me with Camp Coffee. It tastes the way good coffee should be because it's made as good coffee should be. Do you agree? If you haven't tried, you're missing the fun at 11 o'clock each and every day. 2 and 7pence halfpenny a bottle from your grocer, the one on the corner, your permanent grocer or supermarket, and for 2 and 7pence halfpenny a bottle of Camp, you get 42 cups full. It's the great coffee taste of Camp.
Wonderful Radio London.
Since the start of Radio London, Philip Birch had been in discussion with the Performing Rights Society and Phonographic Performance Limited over royalty payments for the use of recorded material. Phonographic Performance had refused to negotiate, but in February 1966 an agreement was finally reached with Performing Right.
There were 2 fees involved, Performing Rights and the other one was PPL. We went to both organizations at the beginning, just as we went to the news service. One of the things that was very important to Radio London is that we ran our business as in an ethical way, or as much as we could under the circumstances. We were extraterritorial. We were not pirates, and we did want to pay for everything that we used. And so we went to PRS and to PPL and worked out a scheme with PRS, Performing Rights, and we paid them on a formula that was we had to advise them of our advertising revenue, and I forget the percentage, but we paid them a percentage of our income monthly. We offered the same arrangement with PPL, but they declined because they had a problem with the musicians' union, as I recall, and they felt that it would be politically wrong for them to accept money from us. They would rather go on saying that we were stealing our music, even though we'd offered to pay for it.
Philip Birch had also authorised the construction of a new studio on board ship. The small on-air studio had doubled up as a production facility when Radio London was off the air, but now that the general living standards on the Galaxy were improving, it was decided to devote the original studio for production purposes. Australian engineer David Hawkins, who joined Radio London in February 1966, helped with the construction.
The new studio, which was larger, little posher, had a homemade console that had been made principally on shore by a one-time BBC colleague of Martin Newton, a chap called Peter Posthumus, Post Electronics. He produced a lot of the elements, if you like, and the metalwork, and it was assembled on the ship. The rebuilt studio had a quite ergonomic layout of RCA cartridge machines, gates, 3 gates turntables, and a tape deck. But in fact, it was a far better on-air studio than the original studio.
Radio Zagreb, a Yugoslavian station broadcasting on the same frequency as Radio London, claimed in December that Radio London was interfering with their broadcasts, although no official complaint had been received. This was more ammunition for Anthony Wedgwood Benn, and to avoid a possible confrontation, Curzon Street sent instructions to the Galaxy's engineers to give the matter urgent consideration.
We ran 2 powers depending on the time of day, because as night fell, as the range of the transmitter increased substantially because of ionospheric reflection, we started to cause fairly serious interference problems with Radio Zagreb in Yugoslavia, or what was then Yugoslavia. So we reduced power from a nominal 50 kilowatts to a nominal 35 kilowatts to alleviate that problem. Didn't, of course, completely stop complaint from Zagreb, but it did take the edge off it.
Philip Birch.
We immediately contacted the embassy in London, the Yugoslavia embassy, and asked them about the complaint and what times it was happening and all the rest of it. They said they'd not heard of this complaint at all. So it wasn't important enough that Yugoslavia had even bothered to tell the London embassy, and so we asked them to follow up and check it out and see if it was a complaint, because we were honourable people. So they checked it out, came back and said no interference, it's just a story.
Wonderful Radio London, it's just great for fun.
Work on the new studio was complete at the end of February, and on-air operations transferred to it on the 1st of March 1966. 2 days later, regular transmission hours were extended to 2 a.m., followed on the 20th of March by an earlier start at 5:30 a.m.
Good evening and welcome to London After Midnight. This is Ed Stewart with you from now 12 midnight till 2 o'clock on London After Midnight.
By now, the offshore radio fleet was growing rapidly, but the most significant development was confirmation that a new and powerful American-backed twin station would shortly drop anchor off Frinton. This prompted the Postmaster General to announce that legislation to deal with the situation would be introduced as soon as the parliamentary timetable allowed.
Bulletin! Stand by. Here is a Radio London News Bulletin.
At the end of March 1966, Texan Programme Director Ben Toney left Radio London. His American commercial radio experience had undoubtedly been a key reason for Big L's astonishing success in just 16 months of broadcasting. And he had gained much respect in broadcasting circles and the music business. Toney had also married his Curzon Street secretary, Rona Clark.
My contract with the company was that I would be there for 18 months and set it up, and then I would come home. I hadn't been home in a year and a half, at the time I left. And in the meantime, I had gotten married, which added to my cost of living considerably, and I would have stayed on over there, I guess, but I was, at that time, pretty anxious to go home for a visit anyway,
However, Ben Toney's planned return to Texas was temporarily delayed with the reappearance of a familiar name, as we'll discover shortly. But at Radio London, his expected replacement, senior DJ Tony Windsor, was passed over in favour of Alan Keane, who would also continue as sales director. Keane immediately turned his attention to the Fabulous 40 playlist and the station's relationship with the record companies.
I did take a firm control of ensuring that the chart list, for obvious reasons, was applied from my desk only. It had in the past been a matter of, I sensed, sort of a referendum on board the ship, but I stopped all of that. I didn't make any drastic changes to the format at all, merely the playlist was controlled a lot tighter. So here, for the first time, was a radio station, because the BBC didn't do it, but was reaching young potential record buyers. They were the young people. And we gave the record companies the opportunity to sample their product. Now, at that time, there was so much publicity going on from the Labour government about their intentions to close down the pirates. They claimed that we were interfering with other wave-length frequencies. They claimed that it was impossible to accommodate all these stations on the wave bands which we had available. How untrue that was, looking back. So, with this false attitude publicly of record companies denouncing us, it was rather interesting, because when I first took over the job as program director from Ben Toney, I realized that without the record company's product, we didn't have anything worth playing. So I rang the record companies and spoke with the promotion men and said, hey, I'd like you to come round, please. I'd like to introduce you, introduce myself. I've seen you passing through the building in order to see Bentoni, but I'd like to maintain a relationship or create a relationship with you. So they came round. Now, one particular day, I was invited to join the EMI table at some function or other, an industry affair. And the host on that particular table, which I sat two seats away from, was Sir Joseph Lockwood, who was then the top man, the chairman of EMI Records. And I found during the course of conversation that he still didn't wish to, although he'd invited me there, he'd permitted my presence, but he still made these sort of little remarks which were not offensive, but they were to the point that, with a frown expression, really we shouldn't be talking with you. And I said, Sir Joseph, with respect, I'm quite surprised to hear you say that, because you'd be amazed. I mean, every Thursday morning at 11 o'clock, at least 3 of your employees queue up to see me and play the product and ask me ever so nicely and politely whether we would consider playing them. So I find that a bit amusing, and it didn't go down too well. But I made my point. It was quite silly to become so opposed to an opportunity when in reality it was the best thing that ever happened to them, because all of the pirates, they sold records. And that was the background to the attitude of the record companies,
Alan Keane was also concerned about payola. Stories had circulated that several Radio London DJs had been involved in the practice of receiving payment in exchange for giving certain records airplay. But there was no real evidence of this, as Ed Stewart confirms.
Well, I personally never came across it. We weren't able to go to lunches, you see. The only time that we were taken to lunches was on our weeks off, but there was never any question of payola. There used to be characters who used to take you to lunch, and they used to say, now, have you heard this record? Because we can send you out the old acetate, as they were called then, of it. We can make it exclusive of Radio London. But there was never any money changed hands or nothing like that. I mean, dear old Jonathan King, he was the first one to make us feel that we were really disc jockeys and really having an influence on people's listening habits, because he used to take us lunch to the old Terrazza, which was the inn place in Soho. And invariably we would go back and make sure that we played his record. But there was that wasn't payola.
Bribery of one sort or another could have its funny side, as Eddie Blackwell recalls.
We suspected that one or two of the jocks were having one or two little goodies sent out to the ship, so we got very tough and we stopped anything going out from Harwich and so on. And one day a huge parcel arrived in the office, which had been redirected from Harwich, and it was a case of champagne. We could see that it was a case of champagne. It was addressed to TW, Tony Windsor. And so we waited until Tony came off the ship. And he walked into 17 Curzon Street, hello, and all this business, and went round and shaking hands with everybody, full of the joys of spring. And we said, Tony, what is this case of champagne which was going out to the ship that was obviously being sent to you? He said, good heavens, no, that wasn't for the ship, that was for you. And he ripped it open and ran round the office giving everybody bottles of champagne. I thought he handled that absolutely brilliantly.
Wonderful Radio London.
Shortly after Bentoni left Radio London, disc jockeys Earl Richmond and Dave Cash announced their departure. Cash's replacement on The Breakfast Show was Mike Lennox, but once again the station was looking for new DJs to make up the numbers. Chris Denning had worked in Forces Broadcasting and BBC Two Television before joining Radio Luxembourg in 1964. His fondness for practical jokes eventually cost him the job, and he returned to London, where a chance encounter with Ed Stewart pointed him in the direction of Alan Keane.
So I got talking to Ed, and he said, where are you going to work now? And I said, well, I don't know really, I've just got to find something for myself. He said, you don't want to work on Radio London, do you? And I said, why? Are you in a position to? He said, no, but I know there's a job going. They're desperate. He said, there's a guy called Johnny Moran. And I said, well, I know Johnny Moran. He'd been on Radio Luxembourg with me. He said, well, he was due to start tomorrow, and I know that they're in a panic because today he's rung up and said he's changed his mind. He's not going. So the next morning, I went in and saw Alan Keane. He said, "Do you want to join us?" And I said, "I'd love to." And the next day, so 24 hours later, I was on the ship.
Chris Denning joined Radio London in April 1966 and became the first DJ to keep his own name. Using a false name was no longer considered a necessity, which proved useful to Denning, having already built a reputation at Radio Luxembourg.
This is Chris Denning on the Double D Show. It's 18 minutes after 2, and as I was saying... Let's have a little listen to the number by Mr. Wayne Fontana. He's got a record which is out right now called Come On Home.
Following Chris Denning out to the galaxy was Richard Swainson from Radio Caroline to take over Earl Richmond's job as ship administrator and assistant to Tony Windsor. As Swainson joined, a national opinion poll survey now confirmed Radio London's total weekly audience as being in excess of 10 million people. This was good news for the advertisers, who now included Juicy Fruit Chewing Gum and the British Coffee Council.
Juicy fruit adds to your fun. It's a hit with everyone. Fine fruit flavor, what a treat. Makes your mouth feel fresh and sweet. Juicy fruit adds to your fun. Juicy fruit chewing gum.
Have you caught on to new Juicy Fruit yet? You'll love its tingling, juicy, fresh fruit flavor. And it lasts mouth-wateringly longer, too. Try new Juicy Fruit and give your taste a joyride. New Juicy Fruit Chewing Gum in the bright yellow packet, sixpence.
Juicy fruit adds to your fun. It's a hit with everyone. Fine fruit flavor, what a treat. Makes your mouth feel fresh and sweet. Juicy fruit adds to your fun. Juicy fruit chewing gum.
Take some with you wherever you go.
Sailing in from Miami on the 2nd of May 1966 came the motor vessel Olga Patricia, taking up position close to the Galaxy and the Mi Amigo off Frinton-on-Sea. Aboard were two 50-kilowatt Texan-backed radio stations, Swinging Radio England, offering a 24-hour top 40, and Britain Radio, the hallmark of quality, with an easy-listening format. Behind the elaborate venture was Don Pearson and another Radio London investor, Bill Vick. Tom Danaher also had a hand in the project, although both Pearson and Danaher still had a financial interest in Radio London. With $4 million of investment, the new operation looked like the first serious threat to Big L's domination of the offshore radio airwaves, and, true to character, Don Pearson only wanted the best. Ben Tony.
Don came along and he offered me a pretty good chunk of money to stay there for 2 months and help him get Radio England and Britain Radio on the air, which I did.
Swinging Radio England, time now is 3:30 on May the 3rd, 1966. First day on the air for Swinging Radio England.
Unfortunately, the Olga Patricia had been hastily equipped in Miami, causing serious technical problems which delayed the official launch until June. By this time, Ben Tony had returned to Texas, but the delays and brash format soon made Radio London realise that the new competition would not pose such a major threat after all. However, this did not prevent Radio London from announcing that it would shortly increase power to 75 kilowatts. But in reality, this was a clever marketing exercise, as Dave Hawkins confirms.
The transmitter actually could produce a little more than 50 kilowatts. I think if you did the sums on the anode voltage and current and so forth, you come up to radiated power perhaps nearing 60 kilowatts when the thing was very finely tuned and so forth. But no, it was pure PR. We did some improvements actually to the antenna. And that resulted in a better propagated signal, and that was in fact passed off as a sort of an upgrade of the transmitter power. But it was PR.
Radio London, the only station with 75,000 watts of instant.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Radio.
Radio.
Big. L. Wonderful Radio London.
The arrival of Radio England and Britain Radio coincided with my own arrival on Big L. I had originally come from Forces Radio overseas. I joined Caroline in 1964, moving to Radio Luxembourg, and in 1966 was headhunted by Alan Keane and was delighted to be invited to join the Big L team, whom I had admired and respected for nearly 18 months.
Right, we've got the OXO show in just a few moments with TW from London, and we've got a coffee break at 11 o'clock. So while everybody's getting organised to make a mental note on paper of coffee break, let me tell you, which is worth writing down today, it says here, let me tell you about Scripto fibre pens, because I write my scripts with those. It also says here, it has a miracle long life tip, a mass of tiny fibres that gives clear, smooth writing. And I like neat writing, so there you go. A Scripto fibre pen has a long life ink supply as well. And they're available in 8 vivid colours, and they range from olive to mauve, to yellow, to brown, to green, to black, to blue, to red. All 8 colours. Scripto fibre pen makes writing fun. And do you know how much they cost? They cost just 1 shilling and 3 pennies. So remember the name, Scripto fibre pen. And if you've got on there, jolly good.
There were now renewed reports of an impending government clampdown on the offshore stations. But, once again, action was deferred. Meanwhile, the local radio association had been formed to put the case forward for establishing 285 low-power commercial stations, while the BBC pressed ahead with plans for 9 local stations funded by the licence fee. Offshore radio had certainly stirred up a hornet's nest.
20.5 minutes after the hour of 1 o'clock, and ladies and gentlemen, you know what's just happened. The tenders arrived, and as I've told you before, it's a little rough out here on Big L, and today we are going boom-ba-de-boom, boom, 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 boom. Oh, it gets so sick-making, it really does. I knew you'd want to join me in a Lennox type barn dance.
At sea, Radio London continued to recruit new DJs. Australian Graham Gill had been a panel operator for Alan Freeman on station 3KZ in Melbourne, but his stay on the Galaxy lasted all of 2 weeks, and at Don Pearson's invitation, he moved to Radio England. Next aboard was Willie Walker, a yachtsman from Bermuda and an old friend of Duncan Johnson and Mike Lennox.
That's the Pirates and Shades of Blue. It's a big old climber for you. This week, yes sir, it's 20 before 7, and this is Uncle Willie, YTWW sitting in for you. Big L comes to Greenford. Yes sir, Big L comes to Greenford every Saturday night, commencing Saturday, July the 2nd, at the Starlight Ballroom, Greenford. The Big L Show, presented by top Radio London DJs.
At the beginning of June 1966, with the start of the redevelopment of Harwich Docks, tendering arrangements for the Galaxy and her North Sea companions transferred to Felixstowe. Taxis were used to take disc jockeys and crew to or from Ipswich railway station on the London-Norwich main line.
Happiness is a thing called Big L.
There was a treat for Kenny Everett fans when, on the 6th of June, he rejoined Radio London. Since his dismissal in November 1965, Kenny had, among other things, presented sponsored record shows for Radio Luxembourg. Just prior to returning to Big L, he was heard on the station's pre-recorded Top Deck Shandy show, and following a call to Alan Keane and a promise to behave himself, Keane invited him back.
I've just got one thing to say about Radio London. It's wonderful.
Following Kenny out to the Galaxy one day later was Tony Blackburn. Tony had already made quite a name for himself on Radio Caroline South, joining that station in July 1964.
I remember listening to the test transmissions for the very, very first time I heard these terribly professional, wonderful American jingles, you know, wonderful Radio London, Big L, and I thought that really is the station that I want to work for.
But, as we've already heard, Tony turned down an opportunity to join Radio London in 1965 because he refused to change his name to Mark Roman.
And I didn't like the idea, so I stayed with Radio Caroline, and then after that, after about 6 months, Tony Windsor came back to me and said, OK, we'll have you under your proper name. And I said it was just, I didn't fancy the idea of being called Mark Roman, because Tony Blackburn is my own name anyway. And as I've been broadcasting there for 2 years on Radio Caroline under that name, I thought it was stupid to go under the name of Mark Raymond. So I went to Radio London, and that for me was when really radio, for me at any rate, was really started. You know, it was beautifully run. It made a lot of money, Radio London. It was more professional than Radio Caroline, and the whole thing was just a different organisation. It was professional radio. And it was for the very first time they introduced Top 40 radio, formatted radio. In other words, instead of just putting out anything that you thought of, this was well thought out. It was American radio.
And were you reading your papers the beginning of this week, I think it was? Well, actually, I wasn't reading mine. I was looking at the pictures, as I normally do. I have a certain amount of difficulty reading. But I see they're making a film about the human behind. Honestly, they are. They've got loads and loads of people to pose, and it's a study in walking, and it's all about the human behind. I'd have personally said I'd have thought that was hitting rock bottom, but...
The Tony Blackburn Show. Yippee!
Makes the week go fast, makes the weekend last and last.
14...
Another transfer from Radio Caroline was Bill Hearn, bringing with him a wealth of Canadian experience in every aspect of commercial broadcasting.
Hey, looky there, we gotta shovel out of here. We've got to cap it and snap it for this old... What is it? Monday night, that's right. Hope you enjoyed the past 3 hours right here on the Mark Roman Empire with yours truly, Bill Hearn. Hope that you have a good day tomorrow, and just a thought, you know, something that you should keep in mind as you go through life, and that amounts to never play ping pong with your mouth open.
One reason for Tony Blackburn and Bill Hearn's recruitment was the need to replace Duncan Johnson and myself. We had been sent ashore to work on plans to establish an easy listening station, United Kingdom Good Music, or UKGM, on Radio City's Shivering Sands Towers in the Thames Estuary. City's owner, Reg Calvert, had approached Philip Birch with proposals for a takeover, and Birch saw the perfect opportunity to launch a new station and a new format. Eddie Blackwell.
We were running a programme that Duncan Johnson had produced, which was called London After Midnight. It was an excellent programme, and it was the kind of music that I quite liked. It was a little less frantic, and we were going to run what I suppose I wouldn't have said it was like Melody, but of course there was a very successful fault-based station called 390 run by Ted Albury, which was running that kind of service, and we were going to do something somewhere between the Radio London chart programming and the extremes of the laid-back programming that was coming out on 390. We were going to do something in between.
Philip Birch said, what would you do if you had another radio station and one that you could work yourself? And I said, I'd make it a top 40, but slightly more middle of the road, go for a slightly older audience. He said, I was hoping you'd say something like that. Then Alan Keane said, we've got this idea to do on this fort. And it's out in the Thames Estuary. It's already operating, but not operating very well, and we've got an opportunity to take it over. And so I said, that's all right with me.
The idea was discussed with Radio London's Texan backers and given the go-ahead. Control of Radio City's advertising would pass to Radlon Sales on the 1st of June, and UKGM would start broadcasting a month later. At the time, we could only guess as to the conditions on Shivering Sands Fort, and to determine what improvements should be made, if any, we visited the fort on the 7th of June.
We crawl up this fort. I wouldn't go up the hoist that they had, because I thought it was bound to snap at any time and break. And we crawl up this rusty old ladder, and Skews said, well, I'm with you. So we go up, and finally it gets to the top, or near the top, and there's a few steps which are all felt a bit loose, and it was going very carefully and very gingerly up these things, because they were about 80 feet above water, I suppose. You reach the top, and there's someone in a Rudy Nureyev blue costume, cap, jumper, and tight jeans, and he said, hello, my name's Tom Edwards, but everyone on here calls me Mother. I can't tell you what my one-word exclamation was, but I stepped backward and stepped on Keith Skew's hands, and he nearly fell off.
Yes, Mr. Johnson, I was not best pleased at the time. Had I let go, it would have been a mere drop in the ocean, and I wouldn't be here to appear in this production. My own word for conditions on Shivering Sands was Squallersville. Eddie Blackwell also paid a visit to Radio City.
I've never seen anything like it. As you walked between these sort of crumbling bits of old iron that were once a fort, bits of it fell off into the sea and went down in a beautiful, well-cut suit, my usual business garb, and I felt an absolute twit being hoisted up onto this fort on what was the bottom of a packing case with 4 pieces of rope tied to it. And I thought, my God, why did I ever leave Fleet Street?
Housed on Shivering Sands Fort was a spare 10-kilowatt transmitter belonging to Major Oliver Smedley of Project Atlanta, the former owners of Radio Caroline South. In 1965, Project Atlanta had also been involved in plans to take over Radio City, but the deal had fallen through. When Smedley heard about Reg Calvert's new deal, he suspected that the transmitter had been sold to Radio London and subsequently led a raiding party to the fort with the object of taking Radio City off the air and thus holding Calvert to ransom until he recovered the money owing him for the transmitter. Sailing from Gravesend at midnight on Sunday the 19th of June 1966, the raiders met little resistance from the bewildered Radio City crew. After removing the broadcast crystal from the main transmitter and leaving the boarding party in charge, Smedley returned to Gravesend and thence to Philip Birch's home some 5 miles away in Mepham, arriving as an astonished Birch prepared to take his sons to school. Producing Radio City's crystal, Smedley informed Birch that matters relating to UKGM would now be conducted through Project Atlanta. A formal meeting would take place in London later that morning. Dennis Maitland.
Phil Birch was shaken by it, without doubt. As I recall, we heard about it something like 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. Phil Birch had not come into the office at that stage, but he was shattered by it. I mean, there was little doubt by that. And, of course, we pulled out of any possibility of getting involved with that particular fort.
Hearing about the events on Shivering Sands Fort, Reg Calvert immediately threatened Oliver Smedley with violence, but the following day, the 21st of June, Calvert complained to the police, who, powerless to intervene due to the fort's position outside territorial waters, suggested he reason with Smedley in a better frame of mind. That night, Calvert went to Smedley's home near Saffron Walden in Essex, forcing his way in after assaulting the housekeeper. Hearing the commotion, Smedley rushed out the back, asking a neighbour to call the police. He returned with a shotgun, just as Calvert appeared to throw a heavy object towards him. With a reflex action, Smedley pulled the trigger, and in an instant, Calvert lay dead.
Dateline, Wednesday, June the 22nd, Essex. William Oliver Smedley has been charged with the murder of Reg Calvert, the head of Radio City, who was found dead in a house in Saffron Walden this morning. Smedley was remanded in custody for a fortnight. Mr. Calvert died from a gunshot wound in the chest. The next news on Radio London is at 2:30. This is Keith Skills reporting.
With Reg Calvert dead, the plans for UKGM were abandoned, and Calvert's widow, Dorothy, announced that Radio City would continue. The boarding party left Shivering Sands Fort on the following Sunday, partly due to the intervention of Philip Birch, and within 25 minutes Radio City was back on the air. As for Oliver Smedley, Saffron Walden magistrates reduced a murder charge to manslaughter, and at Chelmsford Crown Court on the 18th of October 1966, he was found not guilty and acquitted on grounds of self-defence. However, the events surrounding Radio City in June 1966 had wider implications, for no government, even if sympathetic to the cause of commercial radio, could stand for what amounted to anarchy off the British coast.
Have the thrill of driving a racing car yourself at Britain's most famous racing circuit, Brands Hatch.
Radio London's association with motor racing continued throughout 1966, and on the 19th of June, Brands Hatch was the venue for the Radio London Trophy meeting, which included guest appearances from the Walker Brothers, Tom Jones, and several Big L DJs, including myself, and I still vividly remember the occasion when thousands of people attended and scenes were reminiscent of Beatlemania as fans invaded the track. There were now 14 disc jockeys employed by Radio London, working a shift system of 2 weeks on and 1 week off, with usually around 8 DJs aboard ship at any one time. Life on the Galaxy had its funny moments, as Chris Denning recalls.
I used to wear a toupee. My mother thought I looked bald on television, which she was mainly right, because I was bald. And in fact, when I finally decided that it was totally ridiculous wearing a toupee, I got rid of it by chucking it in the dustbin on the spur of the moment, and I poured a tin of Heinz cold custard on it to make sure I didn't change my mind. But anyway, I was wearing this toupee, and I'd only been on the ship for a day or two, and somebody said to me, let's play a joke on Ed Stewart. So what happened, we were all sitting down for a meal, and he came in, and I contrived an argument with him. And it wasn't a very serious argument, and he went out to the kitchen, or whatever you call it on the ship, and he came back, and by the time he'd come back, I took my toupee off. They all said, take your toupee off. So I took my toupee off, and I'm sitting there, and you know, people don't notice. It's a funny thing, they don't actually notice. They know there's something wrong slightly. And I said, Ed, what you said just now, you know, was rather upsetting. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, I'm very sensitive to this kind of thing, and I don't like your attitude. And he said, what do you mean I didn't say it? And he really had hardly said, I don't know what it was, I can't even remember, but it was nothing, you know. And I said, well, it was very unpleasant, and I wasn't very happy with that at all. And I said, I don't know if you know this, but I suffer in a medical way, and I'm very sensitive about things like this, and if I'm upset, I'm afraid all my hair falls out. And he looked at me and he said, oh, I'm terribly sorry. And I said, fortunately, though, it's got double-sided sticky tape, so I can easily put it back on again. He said, you bastard!
In July 1966, Willie Walker and John Edward left Radio London. Joining the station was Australian Norman St John. He had worked at 3UZ in Melbourne and Channel 9 television before coming to England and a job on Radio Caroline South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chris Denning. Chris is going off today on the tender. Hope you have a wonderful time while you're away. Hope you don't come back.
Good afternoon.
Yes, indeed.
By the summer of 1966, Radio London's revenue was exceeding £1 million a year. Among the latest advertisers was Regent Petrol, a contract secured by Eddie Blackwell, with a commercial voiced and produced by Kenny Everett.
They were running an advertising campaign which had a picture of a cowgirl, and they were giving away a bullet, a sort of bullet-ridden sticker which you pinned on your, stuck on your car windscreen, and it looked as though you got bullet holes in it. And the slogan was Ride Regent, the lively one. And I said, what about some money for radio? And the agency guy said, well, if you can come up with a commercial, fine. So the next day I was out on the ship, and I explained it to Kenny. He'd seen the ads, the posters, and I think he'd heard there was a television commercial. And I'm not exaggerating, he made one take. He picked out a couple of records, a sound effect record, and a record I think called Shotgun Wedding. And he produced a 15-second commercial, absolutely right on the button, which was perfect. I took it back to the agency the next day. They immediately gave me £5,000 to spend on it. And I think about a fortnight later, they spent another £5,000. I mean, that was big money, you know.
Stick 'em up, partner. Get a Regent bullet hole sticker at your Regent service station and be a lively one today. Ride Regent, the lively one.
Philip Birch also remembers the enthusiastic response from advertisers using radio for the first time.
The medium was reaching a different kind of market from other media. I mean, it was particularly strong on young people in their teens and in their 20s. And so products appealing to that age group did very well. It was also strong among housewives, and housewives, of course, account for the expenditure for most families. I can remember Wrigley's was one of our great supporters, one of our great advertisers, and the managing director of Wrigley's himself took a great interest in radio advertising because it had been so successful in moving their product. And in those days, we advertised cigarettes, and cigarettes were very good users of radio, and they liked that very much because, of course, they wanted to sell to the young market, create the habit for lifetime.
Strike it rich with Richmond.
Light up a Richmond, strike it rich.
Richest flavor yet in a tipped cigarette.
Light up a Richmond, strike it rich. Strike it rich with Richmond.
Just 4 and 3 for 20. Remember that next time you buy cigarettes. Now's the time to switch to Richmond.
Light up a Richmond, strike it rich. Strike it rich with Richmond.
Go on, switch to Richmond. Just 4 and 3 for 20.
Despite offshore radio's rather tarnished image following the recent events at Radio City, the amount of business now being generated by Radio London was quite remarkable, and this was good news for the Texan investors.
They were hilarious. I was the best friend of everybody in Texas that was involved with Radio London.
However, Tom Danaher was so occupied with his own business interest in Wichita Falls that he had no real idea just how much money was coming in.
I was so encumbered with Radio London and running my business here that I never really even watched to see how much money was going into our Panavest accounts down in the Bahamas and in southern Florida. See, we had several bank accounts, but it did start making money, and everybody started getting happier. And that's about all I can remember about it. Of course, I was running the Volkswagen business and trying to keep my charter flying business going and so on, and I really didn't even notice how much money was going into the bank account. Some of those guys would be checking it 2 times a day, I think.
Keeping a closer eye on proceedings were Mal McElwain and Jack McLaughlin. They would fly over from time to time, visiting both the office and the ship. By way of saying thank you to Philip Birch, the Texans had promised him a Rolls-Royce once Radio London was operating at a profit. Dennis Maitland.
We reminded them, Alan Keane and I, and we came in and we announced that in the light of the fact that they had promised him a Rolls-Royce, that we had indeed bought the Rolls-Royce. And we'd located the Rolls-Royce, and we knew where it was, and that it could be brought up whenever they wished. I mean, they were totally untrue. And at that time, you could not buy a Rolls-Royce new for love nor money. You had a year's waiting list. But nevertheless, we called their bluff, for want of a better expression. And they honoured it, and he got his blue and silver Rolls.
On the 3rd of July 1966, a government reshuffle saw former Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasury, Edward Short, take over as Postmaster General. The government, finally stirred into action by the Radio City shooting, announced that a bill to deal with the pirates would be introduced into the House of Commons at the end of July. As predicted, the Labour government would not consider establishing local commercial radio stations onshore, and radio would remain a BBC monopoly. But Edward Short hinted that the BBC would be asked to provide a national pop music service to replace offshore radio. However, when questioned by a BBC reporter about the demand for all-day pop, Mr. Short had this to say.
I'm not sure there's a demand for non-stop pop. I think there's a demand for young people for a lot of pop. I've got 2 teenage children, or just out of their teenagers, and I think there is a demand for a lot of it. I think there is certainly a demand for perhaps a non-stop music program, something of that kind.
Philip Birch responded by saying that common sense would prevail and the bill would not become law. If the worst did happen, Radio London would replace its British DJs with Americans and move the centre of its operations to a country like Spain. Advertising would come through the international agencies in New York and Paris.
We're gonna move, yeah. We're gonna groove, yeah. We're gonna prove, yeah, that you'll hear all there is to hear. Right here on Wonderful Radio London.
In August 1966, Kenny Everett was invited to join the Beatles on their 17-day tour of North America. Alan Keane and Philip Birch explain.
I was approached by Tony Burrows, who at that time was the part of the management team responsible for the Beatles at NEMS. And he said to me, Alan, would you be interested in discussing the possibility of getting coverage of the Beatles tour in the States? And without hesitation, I took the opportunity and said, not only would we accept and like to be involved, but we could then arrange for telephone calls from various hotels throughout the tour by one of our disc jockeys to telephone our offices. We would record the telephone conversation, put them into program form, and we would broadcast them. My next objective, of course, was to decide who was going to be the person. You can well imagine that every one of the disc jockeys would have given anything to be the actual link and the person responsible for going there and providing these programs. I decided, and there could be no other choice. It had to be Kenny Everett.
We chose Kenny Everett because he was the right age and he was from Liverpool and couldn't go wrong and didn't go wrong. We had him phone Harwich direct, and then a boat went out instantly with the story to the ship, so that the ship could put it on air almost immediately. Probably a few hours after the telephone call.
Hear the real story on your official Beatles station, Big L 266, this Friday at 7:30 till 8:30. Friday, Beatles and
Bassets, jelly babies.
Kenny's having a marvellous time in the States at the moment, everyone. That little thing there was on tape, as you obviously guessed. And he's following the Beatles around the States. In fact, he's flying in the same plane with them, dining with them, sleeping. Well, he's having a good time anyway. And he'll be back reporting, not actually back in this country, but he'll be back as far as Big L listeners are concerned tonight at 7:30, between 7:30 and 8, when he reports direct to Paul Kay on Radio London, live and direct from the States. In fact, today from Toronto in Canada on the Beatles' progress.
As Kenny Everett toured with the Beatles, Chris Denning terminated his stay with Radio London to join the BBC Light programme.
You're back on the Hello, W show, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. We go right through till 12 noon. Thanks very much for the news, Chris Denning. That's the last you'll be hearing of Chris Denning for a while, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. He leaves us, I hope not for long, to fulfil other commitments, but he carries with him the good wishes of our management and all the DJs on Big L. Good luck, Christopher.
Also departing Radio London was Duncan Johnson.
I went back on the ship and I had a slight contretemps with Tony Windsor, who was in charge on there. If there was an empty chair, I said, well, I have to sit down and have something to eat. But I sat at the head of the table, and it was Tony Windsor's chair, which he arrived late for lunch, and he had all of 6 feet to walk to the dinner table. And he got very upset about me sitting in his chair. And so I said to Alan Keane, it's either him or me. And it's obviously going to be him because he's the man in charge. I'm only second in charge. And that was the end of my Radio London career.
You're in Dave's Den and you're very welcome.
Big new sound. Woo! Everybody's tuning to Channel 66 to hear new sounds because they know this is where they happen first. Let Channel 66 turn you on by turning on Channel 66.
Thank you very much indeed, Duncan Johnson. Right now we're going to have a Revive 45 for you. This time it comes from Len Barry and 1, 2, 3.
The latest DJ recruit was 19-year-old Alan West.
By design, I'd made a tape, a demo tape, which I hawked around all the stations, London offices, in a matter of 2 days. And on the same day, the second day, I was offered jobs on Radio City and on Radio London. And Radio City were prepared to pay £10 a week, I seem to remember thinking, and you had to take your own sheets. But Radio London, on the other hand, were offering £55 a week. Can you imagine? In 1966, that was, by anybody's standards, a fairly good salary, so naturally I accepted Radio London.
It was inevitable that some of the DJs joining Radio London would fall by the wayside. Richard Warner had a very short stay aboard the Galaxy in 1966, and for him and Alan West, it was similar to being the new boys at a boarding school. Their colleagues had developed a very sense of humour and relied on crazy antics to relieve the frustrations of being cooped up at sea for 2 weeks at a time. Girls' names were in during the summer of 1966, among them Bessie Blackburn and Edith Everett. I seem to remember I was Samantha Skews, Although the name didn't stick after the offshore stations closed down, T.W. Tony Windsor was known as Wendy, although as senior DJ he was appropriately soon known as the Mother Superior. This practice had first started at Easter as Ed Stewart, already known as Stewpot after his ability to wobble his stomach, recalls.
Tony Windsor was the lifeblood of the ship, in as much that you prayed that you were going to be on the same shift as him. He was a laugh a minute, especially at meal times, and he, being slightly camp, he was the one instigated all these girls' names and everything, you know. And he was a great impersonator, and he was a very, very funny man. Although he was very stylised and a bit ancient in many ways, he was still a very warm character on air, and the public adored him. And the people who worked with him, we adored Tony, and it was, he was the one that you wanted to be with, because there was never a dull moment with good old Tony.
From the day I started radio, I've never had any script. And this has been a disadvantage, I suppose. I think the people in England got used to it. And so I had to stop all of a sudden being vague, terribly vague. And I had to stop and think, what am I going to say next? And when I'm thinking of this, there's this huge pause. Down in his own studio one day, Kenny Everett was playing some tapes of mine, and he came up to see me with a very, very elated look, as though we were going to make a lot of money very quickly. He said, you know, we can do 3 commercials in your pauses.
Hello, and welcome to Windsor's Castle. Up jumped a coffee break and sprang into the studio. Up jumped a cheese board recipe. His hello can be heard as you listen to your microphones. Sick calls, smile, business, hi to you. Pausing with Windsor, you'll come a pausing with Windsor today.
Every day you can hear him pausing on the radio.
You'll come a pausing with Windsor today. Today. 3 coffee breaks, 2 hellos, 1 recipe. Get the message immediately. He'll see you
Bill Hearn left Radio London in September 1966 to be replaced by Welsh-born Pete Drummond. Known as Dum Dum, he had worked in American radio, and his reputation as a practical joker helped him fit in with the DJ camaraderie.
Tell you what I'll do, I'll see you tomorrow between 9 and 12, okay? 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. Till then, this is the Dum Dum saying goodbye, and have yourselves a good day and a good night's sleep and a good day's work tomorrow. Remember to smile, makes everyone else wonder what you've been up to. Bye now.
Dateline, give us it here. Dateline, Monday the 19th of September, London. In South London this morning, police captured Ronald Buster Edwards, whom they've sought for 3 years in connection with the Great Train robbery. He was detained by Scotland Yard Flying Squad officers and was then taken to Cannon Street Police Station.
Kenny Everett remained the creative genius on the Galaxy, and towards the end of September he prepared for the launch of Radio London's new programme schedule and new sound on the 1st of October. This included a new jingle package from Pam's of Dallas.
Music. Music is your business. Now music becomes your middle name with Pam's exciting Series 31. You put your station at the top of the music scene. You play more music more often, non-stop music day and night. You are now the music authority of your market. This music explosion can and should be yours. Listen and hear your station give birth to a new middle name.
Music. That's our middle name. P-A-M-S. Music. Pam's of Dallas.
Listen to the sound. It's the sound of
music.
Yes, on October the 1st, Radio London pushes forward with an entirely new sound for you on this channel. A sound that'll open up a new chapter in Radio London's history as the #1 commercial station in Great Britain. October 1, it's near, it's new, it's the date we burst open with the new sound of
music. That's our middle name. Wonderful. Music. V-I-G-L.
This is 266. Yes, Radio London, first with new concept sound, presents a new break forward in broadcasting. Yes, Radio London, first with just about everything, brings you letters from our listeners. And today we have a letter from Miss Phyllis McGarkles.
Dear Big L, my friend Bert just won't listen to Radio London. He says some load of old cods, he says. What shall I do?
Well, Mrs. McGarkles, this is a pretty difficult situation. You'd better send us your friend's name and address, and we will visit him at some convenient time, like midnight, and you won't hear from him again.
Among the changes introduced with this new sound of Radio London was an earlier start for the Fab 40 show.
Now be careful.
Up your end, Fred.
Now right down the other end and watch the wheel.
What's those corners? Yeah, you. What are they doing?
Why, they're moving the Fabulous 40 show.
Well, they better watch it, because... Look out!
Oh, dear, there goes a climber.
Yes, mate. The Fab 40 is on the move.
Yes, the Radio London Fab 40 show stays still for no one. Starting this Sunday, the Fab 40 show in its new time can be found at 11 o'clock in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. Needless to say, there'll be a new sound, but that's taken for granted as being part of the new concept. Starting off the new series of Fab 40 programs, Tony Blackburn, your #1 bundle of fun. Yuck. Yes, the new Fab 40 show at its new time of 11 o'clock in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, Sunday. All the new climbers and the top tunes for a new week. Radio London's Fab 40 show, 11 o'clock in the morning until 2 in the afternoon.
It was in October 1966 that Radio London listeners were first introduced to Ed Stewart's imaginary girlfriend, Myrtle. Big L nights were now taking place at the Witch Doctor Club in Catford, and Stewart was responsible for promoting the shows on air.
I was always a great lover of that Balham, Gateway to the South, of Peter Sellers, and Honey's Off Dear. Right, that ghastly woman in the Tropicana tea rooms, whatever it was. And because we were, I think one of the guys I was doing it with said, "Where is Catford?" I said, "Oh, it's down South East London." He said, "Oh, well, they're Belham." I said, "Yeah, it is. Hey, wait a minute, I've got an idea going." So we then started this thing going, "Hello, Catford. Hello, dear. We're going to be down your way on Thursday night for the..." I can't remember the name of the club. What was the name of the club down there?
The Witch Doctor Club, Ed.
Why does half of England pour to the Witch Doctor Club every Friday evening? Well, there are sounds you can rave to. And there are bars you can retire to.
I'd like to put a call out to Sandy at the Witch Doctor Club. Hello, Sandy.
Hello there.
Myrtle came about with that trail, which became very popular. And so every time we did one for Catford, and we were going to Catford, we had to have Myrtle in on it. And so she stuck